Please welcome our first speaker for this afternoon, David Philippson from Dataseat of the Verve Group.
Thank you. In my 20-minute speaking slot, I'll try and stick to 20 minutes. I was at 18 minutes, so I might have 2 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to be speaking to you about Apple's attribution system, SKAN network, sometimes abbreviated as SKAN, but also their recent updates around privacy manifest. But if I go straight into the technical details of the required reasons API and all the technical details that go with it, I thought I'd be getting a little ahead of myself. So what I'd like to do is give you some background, some context on device IDs, and particularly iOS device IDs, because as most historians or economists will tell you, if you study the past, you get pretty proficient at predicting the future, so you get to know what to expect. But before I go into the main body of my presentation, I just wanted to briefly introduce myself to you, my audience, to establish some credibility as to why I might be considered a subject matter expert. So, my name is David Philippson. I am the co-founder and CEO of Dataseat. Dataseat is a DSP. It's an app DSP. We built it from the very beginning on the thesis that device IDs would disappear. So we drive performance, UA performance, without any reliance on device IDs, contextually in a privacy-compliant way. Prior to Dataseat, I founded a business called AdX Tracking. It was one of the first MMPs. I'm showing how old I am now, because that was a long time ago. That was 12, 13 years ago. We sold that to a business called Criteo, and at Criteo, we built one of the world's first in-app retargeting and re-engagement platforms. So if you haven't read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, you should do it. It's a fantastic book, but there's a concept in there about 10,000 hours. I feel I've certainly done my 10,000 hours on all things programmatic, UA, and device IDs. So, to get things moving, I will be talking to you about the history of device IDs. I'm going to be bringing you up to speed with what was announced at WWDC in June last year, and then I'll be giving some advice to you as gaming developers, as app owners, as what you should be doing to remain compliant. So, from the very beginning, in 2007, it's when the very first iPhone shipped with OS 1. It wasn't even called iOS, it was just called iPhone OS 1. There was no app store at the time. Basically, the very first iPhone was basically a phone with your iPod on it and a fully functioning web browser. That was in 2007. It was in 2008. This is when I bought my first iPhone. It actually resembles what you might be familiar with today. But in 2008, we had the iPhone 3G with iOS 2. And it's the very first introduction of the App Store. Apple had a very cheesy marketing slogan at the time that was, there's an app for that. And that was to encourage both consumers to be going to the App Store to look for utility apps, but it was also encouraging developers to start developing utility apps. And it was the beginning of when mobile gaming was starting. It was also in iOS 2 where the first persistent identifier existed. It wasn't IDFA, it was called UDID. Unique Device Identifier. There was many pitfalls with UDID, which I will come on to shortly. Following this, it was in 2009 when the first big advertisers started spending money promoting their apps. There weren't many. It was kind of Groupon, eBay, Viber was one of them. There was a handful, but it was really the start of what was to come. Also, some of the first games came to market, mobile games on iOS came to market in 2009. Some of you, well, it depends how old you are really, might remember Doodle Jump, Plants vs. Zombies, and World of Goo. It's also interesting to note that lots of these represent or are similar to some of the games today. Doodle Jump's hyper-casual. It's kind of hilarious that 12, 13 years later, there's very similar games. And also, Plants vs. Zombies. Very similar to Axie Infinity, the play-to-earn phenomenon from just a year or two ago. So lots of these things tend to go in cycles. When you have big advertisers and some of the big gamers putting media dollars behind campaigns, that was when there was the first need for attribution. This is when I founded AdX Tracking. It's when Oren started Apps Flyer and Charles Manning started Kachava. It seems a long time ago now. At the time, there weren't many ad networks. TikTok didn't exist, Meta didn't exist, not in a way that they could be driving performance. This was pretty much what drove the majority of impressions and performance in the market. AdMob was called AdMob before Google acquired them. Quattro Wireless, Apple acquired, so it became iAd. Millennial Media fizzled away. And Inmobi has been around for a long time. Now, this was the majority of ad networks, but they weren't sharing the persistent identifier, you did, on click with the MMPs. In addition to that, the majority of inventory way back then was actually mobile web. All of your businesses hadn't started yet. There wasn't a huge amount of in-game rewarded video. So the fact that most of the inventory was mobile web and UDID wasn't being shared on click, the MMPs had to invent a way to track. That was fingerprinting, or probabilistic matching, which is now really coming under the headlights because of the changes that Apple is making. In 2012, the Congress of the United States House of Representatives sent a very snotty letter to none only than Mr. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, citing the lack of tools provided by Apple to consumers to prevent unwanted online tracking. This isn't new. This is 12 years ago. This has been around for 12 years. So it's just a matter of this is how long it's taken, for these changes to take effect. But you're beginning to probably pick up my narrative that I really do think change is going to be enforced. The answer from Apple, after the complaints and highlighting the problems with UDID, the problem with UDID is you couldn't reset it. So users couldn't opt out of tracking. So the answer to it was in 2013 with the introduction of iOS 7 with IDFA, ID for advertisers. The very purpose was to give advertisers a means to attribute deterministically, accurately, ROAS to their marketing campaigns. MMPs loved it. It was accurate attribution. I liked it. There was still fingerprinting going on at the time because there was still mobile web. But it was certainly a positive to the industry. But what was about to happen wasn't really predicted, or there wasn't really that anticipation of what was going to happen. And it started with Facebook that launched their iOS app in 2013. At the time, I remember lots of speculation about, well, could Facebook transition from a web browser product to an app browser? It kind of seems hilarious now that we were even questioning it at the time. But it was the start of SRN or SAN. It's a swear word in my mind. I don't like it. It means the same thing, self-reporting network or self-attributed network. It was actually Facebook that created it. It is where MMPs will have to share all IDFAs with AppsFlyer, with Adjust, with Singular. And those and Facebook would then reply true or false. Now there's a clear downside to that. A, you have one of the biggest gorillas in the industry marking their own homework. That's never a good dynamic. But B, it was a huge data collecting exercise. It was a data collecting exercise of enormously valuable data and arguably non-consented consumer data. You can start seeing, when Apple created this as a solution, actually they unleashed something that was even worse than what they had before. And of course, if one of the biggest entities is doing this, and we're all competing for the same media dollars, it didn't take long for Twitter and Google to follow suit. And that really was the start of this SRN movement, which, arguably creates some unfair advantage. And it was then during this period of 2013 to 2017, for me it was the beginning of profile-based behavioral targeting and advertising. To some of you, it may represent the good old days of where you're spending 70 to 90% of your budget with Facebook or Google, and it was easy. You could just create a campaign, press play, and get $1 in install, and ROAS positive after 7 days. Well, we know that doesn't exist anymore, but it did create this dynamic on the ad network side of whoever has most data wins. And imagine if you were an entrepreneur or a founder starting a business, an ad network, between 2013 and 2017. What would you do? It's whoever has most data wins. Well, I'll tell you what most of them did, and a lot of the big names you're familiar with today did start during this period. Well, you had to compete for the same data. So how would they go about it? Well, the CPI buying metric was introduced. Now, this is convenient for advertisers It was convenient for lots of you because you wanted to de-risk buying users. You just wanted to buy a certain number of users at a certain price, or even CPAs at a certain price. So it was convenient for you, but it had a hidden cost. It had a hidden cost because you were, and this is true and reasonable. If an ad network is selling you CPI or CPA, they want a suppression list. They're not getting paid for serving ads to your existing users, so they want to suppress it, which is legitimate, but it's also, the suppression list also gives a disguise for collecting the same data that SRNs have. These ad networks would then insist upon being shared attributed and non-attributed data. Probably still happens today for many of you on Android. You should check your IOs and your DPAs. Because you're sharing all of this data with ad networks, I can guarantee you it's probably benefiting some of your competitors. They may hide behind it just goes into the machine. Bullshit. So I'd have a look at your IOs and your DPAs and question who you are sharing data with. Apple's response was coming. It was obvious to me that it had been kind of looking at this, at these patterns over a period of time. This wasn't what IDFA was made for. For me, it was just a matter of time. I'm surprised it took so long. But Apple's got a history of testing something in an environment before rolling out in a big way. I'm not saying Apple didn't care about Safari. I'm sure they do. But ITP was introduced, ITP1 and ITP2 in the Safari browser. It limits first and third-party cookies in Safari. Now, I'm sure Apple do care about Safari, but I tell you, they care far more about iOS and the App Store and apps than they do about Safari. So this, to me, was the prelude to IDFA's disappearing. Most people didn't agree with me, but I was pretty adamant that this was going to happen. The people would argue, that's going to be terrible for Facebook, and how are we going to run our UA campaigns? I'm like, I don't think they care. But that, to me, was enough for me to start my next business, which is why I started Dataseat in 2019. I thought this was going to happen. I thought then there would be a need in market to have privacy-compliant contextual advertising. Sometimes people call me up and say, bullshit. Isn't it easy for you to say, yeah, that's what I thought was going to happen in hindsight? But no, truly, this is the thesis of my business. This is the proof. This was in May 2020. Where I published this article in Ad Exchange saying I think IDFA is going to disappear. And then, of course, it was just 1 month later, in June 2020, that Apple announced ATT is coming in iOS 14.5. Now, I'm sorry, but I was celebrating. I know this has been problematic for many of you. I know, but just, the facts, as an entrepreneur, I'd put my chips in that particular, roulette square that it's going to happen. So we're like, yay, it's going to happen. But then, I'm sure up to speed now, as many of you are familiar, there was a long old delay for it being rolled out, right? It took a long time. Apple usually announces, and then 2 months later, the iOS rolls out, and then very quickly it's 80-90% usually by Christmas. But here there was almost over a year in delay, which is almost proof of how seriously Apple was taking this. So iOS 14.5 rolls out in April 2021. There's an 80% opt-out. Some people say to me, well, isn't 20% opt-in, isn't that enough? Well, no, it's not. Because you've got to, for attribution or targeting, you're matching the demand and the supply side. 20% of 20% is 4%. It's gone. So anyone, particularly in hyper-casual, we've got 30%. It's gone because it's a matching exercise of one size of the other. But then don't worry, Apple's given us SK ad network, but SKAN 2.0 was, I'm being polite, it was feature poor. Or you could say not fit for purpose. So the whole industry then just begins fingerprinting. It's like, shh, don't tell anyone, we're just going to carry on doing it in a probabilistic way. And that, isn't really going to get unnoticed. So over the subsequent 18 months, Apple gives us further iterations of SKAN, 2.2, 3.2, and then 4, with additional functionality, including view-through, multi-touch, mobile web attribution, additional 3 postbacks, as well as coarse-grained conversion values. So they have been improving the functionality to get past the bar of fit for purpose. It is fit for purpose. So you kind of see what's coming. In June, just gone, so WWDC announcement, Apple announced Privacy Manifest and the Required Reasons API. Now this is from documentation on the Apple website today. This is live today. It could not be clearer. Regardless of whether a user gives your app permission to track, fingerprinting is not allowed. That is front and center and very clear to me. But if you don't take my word for it, perhaps take the word of the late Steve Jobs.
A lot of apps that want to take a lot of your personal data and suck it up into the cloud. A lot.
You've missed the very first few seconds, which he said, we have rejected a lot of apps. A lot of apps. You know, so I am expecting this, but let me go on and I'll move on to what I think you should, as app developers, be expecting. Because they gave a headline in June that they will be enforcing this in the spring of 2024. We're pretty much here now as far as preparation comes. You know, I remember a couple of years ago I was asking all my American friends what spring meant in the US. You know, over here it's when the daffodils come out. But by the way, the last time Apple said it, it was April. So I would say between now and April this is going to happen. I wouldn't want to be one of the people that get my wrist slapped. So what is going to happen? Your app's going to have a privacy nutrition label that will be highlighting all of the data that your app collects. You are accountable for the third-party code in your app. It's no longer, oh, I don't know what their SDKs do. Their app is not allowed, regardless of what your MMP says. So even if your MMP is saying they don't need a privacy manifest, I'm going back a slide now, you do. If you're a gaming company or you have an app and you're using any of these 5 APIs, I guarantee you'll be using one of them. Disk space API. If you push updates out to your users with new levels, new characters, I guarantee you'll be using the disk space API. If you use the disk space API, your app needs a privacy manifest. If you have a privacy manifest, you need to be naming the tracker URL. You know, so I don't care what they're saying, you're going to need it, and of course they need one. Fingerprinting's not allowed, privacy-sensitive SDKs, so what that their names weren't named on the list that Apple published just a few weeks ago? It's irrelevant. They're a privacy-impacting SDK. Of course they do. So you should be asking for it from them. So my recommendations for what you should be doing as app developers: have a completed privacy manifest for your app, listing the tracking domains, work with all of the third parties that have code in your app, and you should just be asking them to have one for default. Start consolidating your UA partners, you know, to work with those that have got a strong scan-only proposition. Anyone that says, oh, don't worry about that, you know, we'll just probabilistically match, just, you know, grill them, or don't work with them, because this is happening. And I'd also say embrace SKAN, as it will become the norm for iOS UA in 2024. And it has many positives. You know, there's been so much negative narrative around SKAN. But there's many positives that people don't talk about. It's got multi-touch attribution. MMPs never had multi-touch attribution because Facebook and Google wouldn't take an impression tracker from AppsFlyer or Adjust. You know, now we've got multi-touch attribution, including Facebook and Google. That's a plus. Publisher transparency. How often would an advertiser go to an ad network and say, can you show me the publishers? And they just gave you a load of bullshit hashed IDs. You didn't know where your campaigns were running. Now you know exactly where your campaigns are running, what your top publishers are. Re-downloads. If you're hyper-casual or dating apps, having an accurate tracking of re-downloads is a really powerful metric and KPI. View-through and click-through. You know, you never used to be able to get view-through or click-through from some of the big video networks. You know, they didn't want to tell you. No, that's just an install. And of course, there's less fraud. You know, the cryptographic signatures that come with Apple's attribution system, there is far less room for bad actors. There isn't an SDK to spoof. You know, and because of that, there aren't all these fraud modules that you need to pay huge license fees for as well. So my advice to you, you know, is to embrace it. It's happening. That is the end of my talk. If you'd like to speak to me about privacy compliant UA with Dataseat and how we would optimize your campaigns using SK Ad Network source identifiers, please feel free to DM me at david@dataseat.com. I have no idea what time I'm on because there's no. That's why you're posturing closer to me. Thank you very much. We're good. Thank you.